When all the sarcomeres in one myofibril and all of the myofibrils in one muscle fiber and all of the muscle fibers in one fascicle and all of the fascicles in one entire muscle, such as the biceps brachii, when all of these structures contract, tension is created. Tension is like a pulling force. It's the force that will create movement or prevent movement in a muscle. Since we're using skeletal muscle as our example, we can talk about a muscle moving one bone closer to another. So use your arm right now to pretend like you're picking up an ice cream cone to your mouth. Your muscle creates tension, enough tension to overcome the downward force of the load or the pull of gravity on your ice cream cone. By producing that amount of tension, the muscle can then create movement and allow you to move your lovely ice cream to your mouth. And I just want to point out that that ice cream there is actually a picture of poop on top of a funnel, because the place that I get my pictures didn't have a picture of ice cream. In the smallest microscopic sense, tension is the result of all of those little cross bridges that are being created and broken between myosin and actin. Remember that as a muscle contracts, cross bridges are created and broken in a cross bridge cycle. But how many cross bridges does a muscle know to make, and for how long should it make them? The motor neuron that is coming from the brain and stimulating a skeletal muscle will continue to excite that skeletal muscle until the action potential, the stimulus, is removed. If there are many subsequent action potentials, the muscle will continue to contract. Tetany is a condition where a muscle refuses to stop contracting. The masseter muscle, which is a huge chewing muscle in your face, that muscle is subjected to tetany and results in lockjaw with certain infections like a botulinum infection. The jaw becomes immovable because of the sustained contraction of that masseter muscle. And this usually results from certain types of bacteria that are associated with rusty metal or soiled food. The tetanus shot that you get every 5 years, or that you're supposed to get every 5 years, it gives you the antibodies to fight those types of bacteria. So the frequency of the action potential or stimulus can determine how long tension is applied, but the resting length of a sarcomere, the distance at which your muscle starts, that also makes a big difference. When we first moved into our house, we purchased a stackable washer and dryer, and back then my back was in good shape, so I was like, sure, I can probably help you lift it, right? A dryer's not as heavy as you think, it's just big. So I had to bend down all the ways, knees flexed, hips flexed, to get my fingers underneath the dryer. And just as I said, my knees and hips were as flexed as they could have been. And I could get the initial movement to lift it with like my fingertips and my forearms, but with my muscles stretched out like that, I couldn't create tension. So in my case, which is the case on the top sarcomere here, my actin and myosin were too far apart to even try to make cross bridges. The zones of overlap, or the A bands in my sarcomeres, were too small. And if that's the case, they can't create a good amount of tension. The opposite situation could prevent you from making contractions as well. If you flex your arm at the elbow as much as you can, almost putting your hand onto your shoulder, even if you wanted to flex it more or contract it more, you can't. There's no room. In this situation, your cross bridges are fully contracted. There are as many cross bridges as you can possibly make, and there's no more. The zones of overlap, or the A bands, are as large as they possibly could be. All of the cross bridges that can form are formed, So the ability to create tension and move a load against gravity is not only the result of an action potential coming from the nervous system, but the ability to create tension and how much is determined by the resting length of the muscle, where your sarcomeres start. So hopefully, if you want to pick up your ice cream cone, I guess, or your dryer, your resting length has to be somewhere in between these two situations that you see right here on this screen. Of course, there are some things that affect the resting length. You don't get to just like determine it. If you stop stimulating your ice cream cone holding arm, gravity will make your arm fall back into a resting state. Once it falls back into that resting state, there are elastin or elastic forces in your muscles, like the elastin in the epimysium and paramysium, and like the coiled up elastin that you see attached to the myosin in your sarcomeres. So these elastic forces, they prevent your arm from falling off when your arm returns to a resting length because of gravity. I'm not making a joke there. That's actually how it works. So in the case of the dryer, I had to contract some muscles, and I had sarcomeres fully open, but I could have created some contraction with opposing muscles to lift the dryer, but that went nowhere. What I did was just basically create like a tug of war in between my muscles. Oh, graphs. I love me a good graph, but I know students don't. So what is this? What is this graph here? It's a representation of all the things that we just said. This graph is trying to show you the relationship between the length of a sarcomere, its starting length, and its ability to generate tension. Look along the bottom of the graph. Along the bottom of the graph is sarcomere length, and it's in percentage, right? So there's an optimum length that your muscles want to be at to produce the most tension. And you would think that 100% is that, but actually muscles have a little play. As you see here from that yellow range that's noted on the graph, that a muscle fiber could be at a resting length of about 75 and maybe or even 125% its regular length, and it can still create tension. Not as much as when it's at the optimum length, but it can still create tension. That length, that perfect length, is different for different muscles. I mean, there are muscles in your calf that have a huge optimum length, but then there are muscles in your eyes that have a very narrow range of optimum lengths. Along the side of this graph is the tension that a muscle can produce when starting at any of those lengths along the bottom. So let's read this graph a little bit, but let's start at the optimum and then move outward from there. The optimum is the peak of this graph. If we want to move away from this peak to the left, that means that we're talking about a smaller sarcomere length that will produce tension. If we move to the right on this graph, away from the optimum length, that means that the sarcomere length is increasing. But also you can see that tension decreases. So technically, I don't want to be on either side of this hill. I want to be on the absolute top of it. I want my muscles to be at the perfect resting length that allows them to create the most tension possible. And that's at 100%. But I do realize that my muscles can be smaller or larger than 100% and still create tension. They just don't create as much tension. For me, with the dryer, I was not in this yellow or orange zone. In fact, for me with the dryer, I was over to the right of the graph where it says not enough, right? For you with the ice cream cone, if you pull it all the way up to flex your elbow and touch your shoulder, you are actually on the left of this graph, right? So how many cross bridges you can make makes a difference.